If you've ever heard the first few chapters of Genesis preached in a church service, then you have probably heard the claim that before Adam and Eve sinned, there was no death or suffering in the world. Now, this isn't surprising, as it's a pretty standard view among most Christians, and is taught early and frequently enough to get ingrained into people's heads. Now, I stated previously that I accept the theory of evolution, and I don't find it in conflict with biblical teaching. But this may seem odd initially, as evolution requires billions and billions of years of death and suffering before the first humans even come on the scene. For this reason, I can see why the theory of evolution may appear to be in stark contradiction with the Bible, at least upon first glance. But before I get into the weeds of how somebody could even possibly believe in both evolution and the biblical account of the fall, I want to make something very clear. I do in some ways resonate with many young Earth creationists. I believe that most of them are genuine and think they are simply trying to promote the biblical view of the world against modernist lies. The truth is, a lot of people who claim Christ as Lord have some very unbiblical views, like that God supports homosexuality, or that abortion is biblical. I mean, just look at Jesus. Depending on who you ask, he was a madman, a cynic philosopher, a Jewish reformer, a proto-Marxist, an apocalyptic prophet, and so on and so forth. So in a world where people commonly twist scripture to suit their own worldview, I can sympathize with the person who genuinely wants to teach according to the Bible. And when we look at all these other misrepresentations, I can see why a Christian evolutionist may look like, at worst, a wolf in sheep's clothing, or at best, someone who's very biblically illiterate. But I can assure you that this is hardly the case, and I think it can be demonstrated from the scriptures that evolution, and more specifically death before the fall, isn't in contradiction with the Bible. I will acknowledge that by just reading the creation story of Genesis chapter 1, there may initially appear to be no signs of death in sight. But once you dig a little deeper, the evidence is, in my opinion, quite compelling. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 28, humans are commanded to subdue the earth. Now, unfortunately, the English word subdue doesn't quite pack the same meaning that the original Hebrew did. The Hebrew verb that is translated to subdue occurs 13 times within the Old Testament outside of Genesis 1:28, and refers 6 times to war conquest. See Numbers chapter 32 verses 22 and 29, Joshua 18:1, 2 Samuel 8:11, 1 Chronicles 22:18, and Zechariah 9:15. But it doesn't end there. 5 times the word is used to refer to slavery. See 2 Chronicles 28:10, Nehemiah 5:5, Jeremiah 34:11, and verse 16 of Jeremiah 34. And of the last 2, they refer to sexual assault and trampling underfoot respectively. See Esther 7:8 and Micah 7:9. Now, the fact is that no matter how you slice it, this word is a violent one, and is not one that would be used in a perfect world free of death. Speaking of perfect, notice that creation is never described as perfect in the Genesis account. Creation is called very good, which it certainly is, but never perfect. The text seems to be written very specifically to let the reader know that although things are very good, it should not be confused with perfection. Now, what's funny is I have actually heard some respond by saying, "Is millions of years of death good?" Now, this might make for a decent argument had that been what was being called very good, which it isn't. God's creation is very good, but death isn't. Personally, I think this is a pretty weak argument when you stop to think about it for a second. Just because part of the world is corrupt and bad, that doesn't mean that nothing in it can be good, especially when God makes it good. But doesn't the Bible explicitly say that sin entered the world when Adam and Eve sinned, and this is why him and all creatures now die? Well, not exactly. Nothing in the text indicates that Adam and Eve were immortal before the fall. Now, this may come as a shock, but you can read the text for yourself. Adam and Eve are never said to be immortal, and when God lays out the curses for their disobedience, he never does anything to make them now mortal. What he does do is curse the ground. As a part of the punishment, he restricts their access to the tree of life so that they cannot become immortal. Genesis 3:22-23 explicitly says this, and it wouldn't make any sense if they were already immortal. In fact, if we look at the punishments themselves, there seems to be another indication that pain could be felt prior to the fall. In Genesis chapter 3 verse 16, God tells Eve that he will multiply her pain in childbirth. Now, if you've passed the first grade, then you're well aware that anything times 0 is 0. Therefore, if her pain is to be multiplied, then there has to be pain to begin with. So, in summary, prior to the fall, we see a command to subdue the earth through violent actions, an acknowledgement of human mortality, and the mention of pain in childbearing. Now, when you think about this for a while, it may not seem like much. I mean, after all, it's just a few passages. But think about the Bible as a whole and this original created state. The Bible has 66 books and hundreds of chapters throughout the entire section. And the time before the fall was 3 measly chapters. So the fact that we have multiple instances of showing that there was pain and death before the fall, when so much of the Bible is dedicated to everything else besides the fall, is really shocking when you start to think about it, because realistically, it's such a small percentage of the Bible that even if there was pain and death, there would still be a decent chance it didn't get mentioned. But didn't God restrict the eating of animals until Genesis 9, after the flood? Well, no, but even if it did, this wouldn't show that death didn't exist before the fall. The first thing that should be noted is Abel's sacrifice. Abel was a shepherd, and as such brought the best of his sheep as a sacrifice to God, and even specifically set aside the fat portions for God. The question is, what did he do with the other sheep, and why did he differentiate between fat and non-fat portions of meat? Well, he presumably used them as food, as they wouldn't have had much use for anything else. Besides this, you wouldn't be sacrificing meat if you weren't going to use the meat in the first place, because a sacrifice is by definition giving something up, but he would have never been using it, and therefore it wasn't much of a sacrifice on his part. But disregarding this, we can just go to Genesis 9 where the supposed prohibition on eating meat is lifted. The text reads, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I will give you everything. But you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is, its blood." What is happening here is a Hebraic formula. The formula starts by restating what is already allowed, that is, the eating of meat and plants, but continues by prohibiting the consumption of food with its blood. Other examples of this allowance and prohibition dietary formula include Leviticus chapter 11 verses 3-4, 9-10, and 20 and 21, and Deuteronomy chapter 14 verses 11-12. Now, even with all of this in mind, some will still make an argument on the basis of Romans chapter 5 verse 12 that death only entered the world after the fall. The text reads, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." Now, I'll admit, it definitely appears to be a slam dunk argument in favor of the view that death didn't exist prior to the fall. That is, until you get to verse 14. Only 2 verses later, the text says, "Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one to come." Verse 14 shows that this death was definitely not a physical one. That is, unless you think everyone from the time of Moses onward is completely immune to death, which I think there is just a tiny bit of evidence to show that this may not be the case. Now that we've observed the scriptural data regarding the subject, I wanted to close out with a different kind of argument, the scorpion argument. Now, this argument isn't one that I developed, but comes from the scholar Ben Stanhope, and I find it quite useful and compelling. The question is, under the traditional view, what would a scorpion have looked like prior to the fall? The creature is covered in protective armor and contains dangerous pincers, as well as a harmful stinger. The existence of a creature like the scorpion, whose entire body seems to be built for combative encounters, would be very out of place in a world where none of these encounters would ever exist. Now, alternatively, one could argue that these traits were just later post-fall developments. Now, that's fine, but this sounds suspiciously like evolution, which is what I thought was the problem here. Because of this, scorpions' existence gives further attestation against the traditional view. Now, I know that what I'm arguing here is quite unpopular, and is kind of foreign to what a lot of Christians view as biblical views. But I think this is completely in line with Scripture, and none of it contradicts evolution or the Bible. For this reason, I think that there would have been death before the fall, and I don't think that evolution is in contradiction with this view.